I just want to get your reaction to what Matt Rack of the Fire Brigades Union had to say. He said, look, strikes are coming. We want to see a Labour Party that is more clearly on the side of workers. You know, this is your opportunity to be clear. What is your take on the strikes next week? Would you give workers the pay rise that they want?
Well, look, my dad was a fireman for 30 years, right? So I know from a personal experience exactly what those members that Matt talked about are experiencing, why they are going on strike, and he's right to say there was a very significant mandate for that. We have been clear. We have to only say the government must negotiate. I can't give a figure for any individual pay dispute the same way the people negotiating can't on television, because that's part of the negotiation. But I would say we are absolutely aware and have consistently made clear that the reason so many people are taking industrial action is because they have seen their living standards, their real wages, you know, what they can purchase, diminish so much over the last 13 years. I mean, one of the few things I agreed with in Liz Truss's essay that she's penned today is the point where she says, compared to other European countries, compared to parts of America, the UK has stagnated over the last 13 years and living standards have fallen. I don't agree with her proposals that she put forward to meet that, and I think she very clearly made that a lot worse. But we do understand that. But we've also got, Sophie, a very, very strong eye and discipline in making clear we believe our plans for the economy will make it grow faster than it has done for the last 13 years. But of course you need to do that to give people, over the long term, the kind of improvements they quite rightly expect.
I don't know if I'm being slightly slow here, but I just don't understand why you can't give a figure. You said there that, you know, Labour can't give a figure for the same reason that the unions can't give a figure, because they're involved in the negotiation. But you're not involved in the negotiation. I don't understand why you can't give a figure on what pay rise you would give to public sector workers.
Well, you've got different issues in different disputes. I mean, part of the NHS dispute is very clearly about workload.
OK, so let's talk about specific then. Would you give nurses a 10% pay rise?
Realistically, the top opening offer, no, we probably wouldn't be able to meet that. But we would negotiate, and fundamentally we have a much more compelling message about those workload problems, because we've got that plan to abolish the non-dom rule for the super rich and therefore use that revenue over £3 billion to vastly increase the numbers of doctors, nurses, midwives in the system. So that would be part of the negotiation. But I don't think if the people who are directly involved in disputes can understandably come on television and give specific figures, it's not helpful, frankly, for us to do. But we're very serious about understanding the burdens people are facing and the fact the government has to recognise that. And the big difference, and you heard it there from my opposite number, Grant Shapps, is that the government, frankly, rather than want to solve these disputes, they want to use them as excuses for the poor state of public services in the country after being in power for 13 years. They want to use those disputes to say that's why public services aren't working. Everyone in the country knows, even when there aren't days when industrial action is taking place, whether it's the railways or the health service, things are not as they should be, and that is the responsibility of the government.
I think everyone would, you know, agree that there is a lot of strain on public services at the minute, but it does feel that that did give a bit of clarity there, that, look, you would get around the table, you'd negotiate on conditions and on pay as well, but 10% pay rises that match inflation would be unaffordable.
Well, look, the government often cites, for instance, the 1970s, where you saw essentially a series of pay negotiations in excess of inflation as people started to expect it. And, of course, that leads to the kind of spiral that ultimately diminishes living standards even further. But let's be clear, I mean, the average settlement in the private sector last year was 7%, well below the rate of inflation. It's just that the public sector settlement was even more significantly behind that. So I don't think working people in this country are being unreasonable, but they do expect their government to listen to the pressures they're under. They would like a little bit of responsibility from the government because, let's be frank, you could argue that the last 13 years have been one of the most disappointing periods in the entire economic history of the United Kingdom, and I don't see the government really being honest and frank about that. So
but Labour wouldn't be able to match the pay demands of public sector workers either.
Well, I think we could settle these disputes fairly quickly if the government were to stand down and give us a chance of doing it, because I think we fundamentally understand those issues around workload, burden. You know, we talk about unprecedented levels of inflation, and that's right, but look at grocery inflation. I mean, it's 17% almost for a lot of, you know, people when they're going out doing their shopping, buying essential items for the household. So, of course, you see in those disputes incredible levels of turnout, of people, very strong feelings about it. They're simply reflecting, you know, the position they're under. And I think many people, by the way, are looking at this and say, you know, now you've got a Conservative government that's been in power now for the same amount of time as the last Labour government. Well, are they better off after 13 years of that Conservative government? And for nearly everyone in this country, the answer is no.
Looking ahead to the strikes next week, big NHS strikes, nurses, ambulance workers. I mean, you're a parent, which, you know, inevitably means you rely more on the NHS. Do you look at some of the headlines around, you know, NHS strikes and feel a bit worried?
Well, I think any family does, anyone in the country does. But I've got to say, I feel worried now at the state of the NHS every day. I mean, sometimes we'll joke to the kids, you've got to behave, you can't, we haven't got time to go to A&E under a Tory government. That's the kind of thing we'll say in our house, because we know the pressures that it's under. And I don't think sometimes when the government tries to cite the pressures of days when industrial action is taking place is the worry to families, that they themselves are aware of just what kind of pressure and concerns there are out there every day because of the state of public services under their watch.
I want to ask you a little bit about the other story I was talking to Grant Shapps about, which is the forcible installation of prepayment meters. Obviously, a lot of people really struggling with their energy bills this winter. And Mr Shapps was pretty scathing about Ofgem. He said that they'd had the wool pulled over their eyes, that they need to raise their game. Is he right?
Well, I think the regulator's got some points to answer here, but I wouldn't mind a bit of leadership and accountability from the government as well. I mean, this was first raised in Parliament before Christmas. 3 weeks ago, Labour called for an outright ban on the process till this was reviewed. It was clearly it's a national scandal. There's no question of there. You skewered Grant Shapps immediately by the fact that he might have said it's a disgrace, but he wasn't saying he was going to stop it. He didn't say that he's going to call for a ban and insist that this isn't happening whilst this is looked into. The process here is deeply flawed. There is no clear definition of where this should happen. What do we constitute as vulnerable? How should debt be treated in that? And clearly what's been happening with the oversight in the courts of this is a huge problem as well. So we want an outright ban whilst this process is looked at again and some clear rules are put in place. And I think the fact that the Secretary of State hasn't been able to say that this morning, and that hundreds of people, maybe thousands, have had this done to them in the 3 weeks since we called for that ban, he's got to be willing to accept responsibility for that.
At the same time, though, the point that Grant Shapps was making was, look, there does have to be some kind of... something has to happen if someone just doesn't pay their energy bill. I mean, do you accept that?
Yeah, of course. If someone's going to pay the bill, I mean, that's absolutely right. But he tried to conflate the process of having a prepayment meter, which actually some people do want. They like to control their energy bills in that way. He tried to conflate that with the forced imposition of a prepayment meter, often with the law being broken. And that is something completely different. The government should be incredibly strong on that. They're not being strong enough because there are no circumstances in which that should happen.
I've got to ask you about the other big story of the day. I mean, you touched on it earlier. Liz Truss comeback. What's your reaction to a piece in the Sunday Telegraph?
Just every week, will there ever be a Conservative willing to take responsibility for their own actions? I mean, Liz Truss had to stand down because her policies were incoherent and unsustainable. And the idea she's been brought down by a left-wing economic establishment. She's been brought down by straightforward economics. If you want to borrow money, as she did, and people don't think your plans mean you can pay it back, well, they're not going to lend you that money. I say the one thing she is right on is the poor record of the government on the economy. There has been stagnation. There has been a diminishing of living standards, but you don't do that by seeking to borrow a huge amount of money for tax cuts for the well-off. And the idea that people in the city who had no confidence in her, and people making those trades that led to the huge pressures in the economy being crashed, the idea that they are somehow part of a left-wing conspiracy. This is really, to me, about the Conservative Party. There are a lot of people who want Boris Johnson back in the Conservative Party. Liz Truss clearly feels that she would seek to make a comeback herself. And I think the biggest danger to the country would be a fifth term of Conservative government where, frankly, all these characters would seek to make a comeback themselves. Do
you think that Rishi Sunak's a better Prime Minister than Liz Truss?
I think there has been arguably no worse Prime Minister than Liz Truss. And I don't say that to be mean, but, I mean, 49 days and the record she had. And ultimately, politics, it's about people, and there are many people in this country paying higher mortgage rates as a result of her actions. And that's had a huge impact on them. Would do it any time, but in a cost of living crisis, it is. But I think fundamentally, you cannot simply judge a Prime Minister if they're better than the last absolutely dreadful one. You've got to judge them on, are they meeting the challenges the country faces? Rishi Sunak isn't. I don't think he's in control of the Conservative Party. I think he's a weak Prime Minister. And I think the big change we need will only come through a general election and ourselves having the chance to put the case for a Labour government.